Do you want to hear about all my bad trips? I thought you would. So in this episode, I'm going to share all the worst trips that I've had on psychedelics. And I'm going to do a bit of introspection here for myself and also for you as to what is really going on inside of a bad trip, what causes them, also perhaps how to deal with them, and also how to avoid them for yourself. So it should go without saying that if you're going to be a serious psychonaut and you're going to be doing a lot of trips, 50 trips, 100 trips or more in your life, you're necessarily going to have some bad trips, what are called bad trips. Now, are they really bad? I mean, it's all relative. It all depends. Once you come out of them and you look at them back in retrospect, then they're not going to look so bad. And in fact, you might be very grateful for them and thankful for them because they will teach you valuable lessons. Just like in life, you can have horrific situations happen to you in life. This happens all the time to people. Bankruptcies, divorces, children dying, health conditions, cancers, and all sorts of stuff like this that you would not wish upon yourself, and you maybe even wouldn't wish upon your enemies because it's so bad. But then in retrospect, you look at it and you say, I mean, yeah, I would not do it again if I had the choice, but it's made me who I am. And there were profound lessons that I learned, and that something very important would be lost if life was just all positivity and rainbows and butterflies and all goodness and none of the hard stuff. All right, so let's get into it. Overall, I would say I've been blessed not to have that many bad trips. But I can definitely think of at least a couple, and really more like probably 5 or 10. At least 2 that were really traumatic, we might say, and problematic. And then maybe upwards towards 10 that were difficult, and I wouldn't want to relive those experiences. And so we have a sort of a gradation, a scale of how bad trips can get. And I don't think I've experienced the worst of the bad trips that are possible. And the reason that is because from the very beginning, I've told you guys that I'm very careful with how I've used psychedelics in the past. I treat them very seriously. I understand the potential for how bad the trips can get, and that's precisely why I'm so careful with them. And I make sure that my doses aren't too high and so on. But, even if you're very careful, if you trip a lot, eventually something will go sideways. You'll take too much, you'll get too cocky, and then bad stuff will happen. So anyways, the first bad trip that I had was on mushrooms. It was on 4 grams of mushrooms. And the way that this one came about was that this was when I was first starting psychedelics. I started with mushrooms, and I took 2 grams of mushrooms, and I loved it so much, it was so amazing, that I decided that in the next few days or in the next week, I'm going to do more. I'm going to do 4 grams. And my goal was that I'm going to go from 2 grams to 4 grams to 6 grams to 8 grams. Like I wanted to work my way up to really high doses. Back then, I didn't really understand what I was getting into. Not fully. And so I doubled my dose from 2 to 4 grams, and I didn't quite understand that was not just going to double the potency of the trip. It ended up like quadrupling the potency of the trip. And so what happened was that I took it. I remember it was coming up. Usually it takes about 30 minutes for the mushrooms to kick in, and they were kicking in around the 30-minute mark. And then I noticed that it was kicking in so strong that I started to get this sense in my mind like, oh man, I don't want it to be this strong. It's getting too strong to the point where it's uncomfortable now. And then it was getting even stronger than that. And so the come up was coming up, and I was noticing how strong it is. And my mind started to want to go back. I wanted to like press the undo button. And I started to tell myself things like, oh, I wish I didn't take these mushrooms today. I don't feel like tripping today. But of course, it's too late. So one of the lessons when you're doing psychedelics that will help you to avoid bad trips is that when you're going into a trip, make sure that you're really engaged with what's going to happen, that your mind is not elsewhere, that you're not thinking that you would rather be somewhere else, doing something else. Like, make sure that you set aside the entire day. You're not at any kind of rush. There's nothing else on your mind, no other kind of business that you're worried about. So you can fully go into the trip, and you have to almost be, how would I put it? You have to be sort of morally prepared to deal with what's going to arise, because difficult things can arise. And sometimes I'm just in a mood where I don't want to deal with difficult things. So if I'm in that kind of mood, I shouldn't be tripping, because the trip could bring up difficult things. And I also have to be in a mood to contemplate. And I also have to be in a mood where I'm not bored or tired of tripping because I tripped just recently. And that was sort of a problem with this particular mushroom trip, is that not enough time passed between the first time that I did it and then the second time that I'm now taking 4 grams. I think it was only like a week that passed. The problem was not the tolerance. That wasn't the problem. The problem is that usually the way it works for me is that I take a psychedelic, insights arise and lessons and revelations, and then I have to ponder those and mull them over and integrate them. And that can take anywhere from a few days to weeks to months to even a year or more to integrate all that. And if I didn't thoroughly digest all of that material, and then I go trip again, then it can feel like it's too much, too fast, and it's too soon. It's almost like I would almost liken it to having sex. If you're having lots of sex, then at some point you have so much sex that you even become disinterested in the sex. But simply because you're in the habit of it, and maybe your partner wants it, and maybe you've been having sex a few times, every day for a few days in a row, maybe by the 3rd or 4th day, it's almost like you want to go do something else because you're tired of it. You're sick of it. You need that space so that it can become special again. You don't want it to be just this habitual thing that you do every single day like a robot. Then the joy of sex is lost. If you have sex every single day for a month, you're going to be so sick of sex. Now, this is difficult for many people who struggle getting sex. This is difficult for many people to actually believe that that's true. Some of you are listening to this and thinking like, Leo, no, I don't believe you. If I could have sex every day for a month, I would be thrilled. That would be heaven. But if you actually do that, you'll realize that no, it's not heaven. It gets monotonous. And you actually start to regret it because you overdo it. Likewise with food. If you eat the same food too much, too many days in a row, and you overfill yourself, by the 4th or 5th day, you're going to be sick of it. You're going to need a break. So it's just like that with psychedelics, except with psychedelics, you need even longer periods of time for a break. At least a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a couple months is usually what I find is what I need. So that then when I come back, now I'm really ready. You have to be sort of thirsty for it, right? It can't just be like, oh yeah, I could trip today, or maybe I could not. That's not a good reason to trip. A good reason to trip is like, I wake up in the morning and I sort of just introspect, and I remember like, I haven't tripped for a few months. And now I'm really feeling like I'm ready for more. Like I really want it. I'm excited. I want to explore. I want to explore the psychedelic terrain. That's when it's a good day to trip. Now, when it's a bad day to trip is when you wake up and you're like, oh yeah, I told myself I would trip today, but I don't kind of feel like it. I would rather just slack off and watch TV, or I would rather just be online looking at videos and stuff, and I want to have an easy day. But I told myself I would trip, so I'm going to force myself to trip. That's already starting off on the wrong foot. And that's sort of how I started this mushroom trip, is on that kind of wrong foot. And so I immediately regretted it, and I wanted to back out of it, but of course you can't back out of it. And then it was a very high dose. I'm also very sensitive to psychedelics, so it was a very high dose for me. Probably what is 4 grams for me might be 8 grams for the average person. And so it came on really strong, and my entire visual field was just completely getting twisted up and melting and going all crazy. And since these were some of my earliest trips, I didn't have a lot of good experience in terms of how twisted consciousness can get. And so what happened was this combination of me wanting to break out of it, but I couldn't. So then I said, well, it's going to last like 3 hours. It's usually about how long a solid mushroom trip lasts, for about 3 hours. And I said, well, I'll just tough it out for 3 hours. But see, that was already the wrong attitude. If you're going in there trying to tough something out, you're already in a attitude of resistance, not an attitude of openness and curiosity, not a passion or eagerness to explore, to contemplate anything. And so what happened was that this trip was sort of forced upon me. I was resisting it. I wish it would stop, but it couldn't. So I was just kind of begrudgingly going along, and it just kept getting stronger and stronger, to the point where I started to go into a state of what I would call madness. This was my first experience of madness, the madness of consciousness. And so I started going down these twisted rabbit holes of consciousness and infinite mind, where I started having these, what at the time seemed like insane insights and visions. Like I would start to imagine that I am all the dinosaurs that used to exist. Which of course is true. You are all the dinosaurs. You imagined all the dinosaurs. But this was my first time starting to realize that I am all the dinosaurs, that I imagined all the dinosaurs. And it was very twisted. Then I went into all sorts of other rabbit holes, and it felt like I was losing my mind. And when you get stuck in one of these rabbit holes, especially on mushrooms, because they're very twisty, you stop even believing that you're going to come out of these rabbit holes. And so the deepest rabbit hole I went down was just this rabbit hole of imagining myself completely losing my mind and not being able to undo it. And then so then I sort of went into this fantasy that I lost my mind, and that I lost it permanently, and that I would never come out, and that I would basically be like an old man sitting in a wheelchair drooling because I lost my mind. And my family would have to like take care of me. That was sort of the deepest part of that rabbit hole. And it felt like pure madness. And because of that, I was able to develop an empathy for people who actually experience true madness, people in insane asylums and so forth. But of course, then the trip ended and I came back. But it left me quite psychologically traumatized, not physically, but just psychologically. It shook me. It showed me just how powerful psychedelics can be. I read bad trip reports in the past before taking that trip, but there's a big difference between just being told what a bad trip is and then actually living through one yourself. And then you appreciate just how powerful these substances are. And so that trip was actually very foundational for me in my psychonaut journeys, because what it taught me is it taught me to deeply respect mushrooms and all psychedelics by extension. And so after the trip passed, I spent that day just sitting sort of curled up in a ball on the floor, just sort of contemplating what the fuck just happened to me and trying to make sense of it. And I really couldn't make sense of it. But I asked myself, like, okay, so what's the lesson here? What was this trying to teach me? And it was very clear that the purpose of this trip was to teach me that as I'm going into psychedelics deeper in the future, this was like an early shot across the bow that God gave me, that these are not tools to be trifled with. Like, you have to really respect the substance, really respect the dosage. Don't get cocky. Don't think that you're going to be able to handle a heroic dose. Don't trip when you're not feeling like tripping. Like, make sure you're really following the right protocol and being extra careful, and you're not doing it from an egoic place. You're not doing it for like a sort of an artificial macho reason. Because in my mind back then, I thought like, well, I would do 2 grams of mushrooms, then 4 grams, then 6 grams, then 8 grams, and I was going to work up to like 20 grams of mushrooms. That was my egotistical sort of idea of what I'm going to be doing over the next few months. And so I was quickly disabused of that notion. That's not the proper way to trip. See, that was a sort of a preconceived plan that I had in my mind. Whereas really, the proper way to trip is that you trip one trip at a time and you don't think too far ahead in terms of what is the next trip going to be? How much should I take? There's no preset dosages. You have to adjust, and you have to be fluid, and you have to be willing to improvise. So you trip, then you integrate the lessons from the trip. Based on the lessons that you got, you ask yourself, when should I trip again? And maybe your intuition will tell you in 4 months. Then that's how long it's going to take. Or maybe your intuition tells you, I'm going to trip the next day. Okay, maybe that's correct because there's something you didn't get and you need to trip immediately to get some more insight or clarity on that point. And if that's the case, then you trip the next day, right? So it can be very variable, and you got to be fluid enough to improvise and to work with that. So that was that bad trip. And that bad trip, my first one, is what saved me from having many more bad trips in the future. I still had a few bad trips I'm going to tell you about here in a minute, but I could have had a lot more had I not had that difficult one really early on, which taught me that lesson. And I really, truly learned that lesson deeply. Because you know what? The greatest teacher is suffering. Suffering exists for a reason. It exists because it can be extremely effective at teaching you lessons that you wouldn't otherwise learn. Deep pain, physical and emotional, teaches you lessons very quickly. You touch a hot stove, and then you probably will never touch one again in your life because you'll integrate that lesson so deeply because it was so painful. And that's what happened to me with this mushroom trip. And ever since, I'm very careful with mushrooms, especially because I know how twisted they can be. The next bad trip that I had was with 5-Amio Dmt. And there were multiple bad trips I had with 5-Ameo, so let me discuss that. So the first and probably scariest trip I had on 5-Ameo was the very first time I tried it. I snorted a small amount of it just to test, maybe 10 milligrams or 50, I think it was 15 milligrams actually, just to test what it was going to be like, because it was a totally new substance. And I knew how powerful it was from everything I've read. So I took it, and then I was shocked at how quickly it came on. It came on in about 5 minutes. And my consciousness was starting to transform in such a radical way, such an impossible way. There was such an expansion of consciousness that also I immediately started to regret that I did this. And then my mind went into a sort of a panic mode. I actually, this is the closest I've come in my life to a panic attack. I'm not a panicky person. I'm not an anxious person. I'm usually very calm and chill. But in this case, my heart started beating fast. I could feel it. I could hear it. And that wasn't so much a physical response to the 5-MeO. It was just that my mind was starting to, as the trip was coming on, it was so radical in its nature that my mind started to paint these sort of nightmare scenarios of where this is going to go, because I had no idea where it was going to go. And I was like, in my mind, I'm like, well, where's this going? Like, is it going to go this place or this awful place or even this more awful place? And so it was like that. And after a few minutes of that, I realized, like, fuck, I just want to go back to how I was. I want to go back to my original sober state, because this could go in some weird direction that I don't want it to go. And that just fed in, because you see, the whole problem with psychedelics is that what they reveal to you that reality is your own imagination. You're projecting and constructing reality. Now, in your sober state, you're not taking responsibility for that, and your consciousness is so crystallized and solidified that thoughts you think don't manifest in the material world. But when you're in a loosened, more fluid state from psychedelics, then your thoughts start to manifest in the material world, and that can be freaky, especially if you're thinking bad thoughts. So if you start thinking that, oh shit, this trip is going to go bad, it's going to go in a sideways direction, that's exactly what's going to tend to manifest. It's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So to trip well, you need to be in a positive, good state of mind, and you also need to have a certain control over your own thought process so that you don't think into negative territory. And you can train yourself to do this. But it takes a while of tripping to sort of learn to surf atop the waves of consciousness that these psychedelics produce. And so at this early stage in my psychonaut journeys, I didn't yet know how to do that or learn how to do that. And so I had sort of a mini panic attack. And this was not even a large dose. Mostly the reason it was such a negative trip for me is just because my mind started to run wild with negative images of where this trip will go. And the trip didn't even end up lasting very long. It only lasted like 20 minutes. And if I hadn't thought all those negative thoughts, it would have been fine if I just kind of accepted it, surrendered to it, and just explored it and was curious about it and open to it. But I was starting to close down. I was starting to resist it. And that's when you typically would have a bad trip, is when you start to resist what's being shown to you. Or when you get the idea that you want to go back to how you were 10 minutes ago. But you can't, because it's taking you in a forward direction. You can't go back when you're just starting your trip, because the majority of it is still ahead of you. So anyways, that spooked me, and it almost spooked me to the point where I didn't want to do 5-MeO again. But a few days later, of course, I knew logically that I had to go back and redo 5-MeO again, because that was just a little test dose anyways. It wasn't the real deal. And that I didn't get the full picture of what 5-MeO DMT was. I knew that that was just sort of an entry point, and it was an awkward entry point, and I got off on the wrong foot. But that doesn't mean I should stop doing 5-MeO DMT. That would be a mistake. And that was exactly correct. I intuited that. A lot of people, if they would have had that first initial bad reaction, they would have said, oh, to hell with this, I'm never doing 5-MeO again. It sucks. It doesn't feel good. It's scary. It's terrible. Well, you have to recognize that can easily just be an ego defense mechanism. You see, your ego will construct all sorts of stories and excuses for why you shouldn't do a nice solid dose of 5-MeO DMT. Your ego knows this is the end. So it's going to invent all sorts of excuses. I've seen a lot of friends and other people who take one dose of 5-MeO DMT and they don't really have a good experience on that initial dose because it's so weird and alien. It's hard to really appreciate it and enjoy it your first time. Just like when you're trying a strange foreign cuisine, the first time you try it, you're not going to like it. It takes actually a few tries of some new foreign cuisine to develop an appreciation for it. Have you noticed that? So it's like that with 5-MeO DMT. And anyways, so I went back for a second dose, and that went much better. Even though it was higher, it actually went better. Because I was now more prepared for what was to come, and I was just willing to surrender to it more. And then the third dose was also a bad trip, but for different reasons. So let me talk about that. And that was the highest dose of 5-MeO that I've done, which was 30 milligrams. So I basically worked up from 15 to 20. Well, there was a 25, and then I went to 30. So that was the fourth trip. The 30 was, I would say, my most traumatic 5-MeO experience. Simply because at that dose, given my level of sensitivity to that substance and to all psychedelics, what happened was that I became so ridiculously conscious that it was a frightening, terrifying level of consciousness. But beyond the physical fright of it, I mean the psychological fright of it, there was actually a physical reaction. So what happened was that my neurological system was overwhelmed by the intensity of the infinite consciousness that I was experiencing, to the point where I had a physical reaction where like this energy shot through my entire body. You might call it Kundalini energy. And it shot out of my fingers and out of my fingertips. It wasn't a visible energy. It was, you couldn't see anything if you were looking at me. But there was such a powerful explosion opening up from my heart and through all my limbs and through the entire nervous system, that it felt like my nervous system was overloaded, like taking a light bulb and connecting it to a lightning bolt. Imagine what happens if you do that. So it was just way too much of a dose. And this was the moment where I first realized God. I didn't even realize myself as God. I just realized that God existed. This was the first time I realized that God existed. So basically, I discovered God at the peak of this trip. And it was so shocking and so awesome and terrifying all at the same time, and also so loving and beautiful at the same time, that it was too much for my mind and for my body to physically contain. And so there was this sort of a negative overloading of energy in my body that was discharged through my fingertips. It actually left scars and peeling of the skin on my fingertips for months. That lasted for months. Took months for that to heal. And it was such a shocking revelation of infinity that it would take me about a year to be able to integrate it and to feel like I'm ready to trip again. So I didn't trip for basically a year. And I was frightened from tripping because it was just too much. And also, I didn't understand exactly what it was that I experienced. I experienced infinity. I knew that much. But there's so much depth to what infinity is, and your mind is trying to figure out what it is and how to pin it down and how to make sense of it and what does it mean? What does infinity mean? It took me a good year of just contemplating that, thinking about it, mulling it over, until I felt like I was ready to go back for more. And when I did go back for more, I lowered my doses, and I hadn't done 30 milligrams ever since, because it's just too much. It physically overwhelms the body, and I think it actually will damage the nervous system if you do it at those quantities, at least for me. So I call that a bad trip, but I mean, it was one of the most powerful and most important experiences I've ever had in my life. The first time you discover God, that is one of the most important experiences you'll ever have. I mean, it's remarkable, it's unbelievable, it's magical, but it's also terrifying. So it's a double-edged sword. And so in my mind, with this trip, I don't even consider it a bad trip. I consider it traumatizing. But it was absolutely necessary and crucial to my development And I wouldn't change it for anything. It was such an important trip for me. And now the trauma has been integrated and worked through, and it's gone. So it's not like I'm living with that trauma. I'm long over it. It took me about a year or two to get over it, and I did, and now it's fine. Other bad trips that I had. I had a bad trip on LSD. There's a strange phenomena that I've noticed with psychedelics where sometimes you take a psychedelic and it doesn't work exactly like it normally does. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of some medicine I was taking or some supplement that I was taking that week. I don't know. Or maybe it's just a fluke luck or something in my psychology. But sometimes I take a psychedelic and it doesn't go normally. It goes sideways, what I call going sideways. When a trip goes sideways, for some reason, it feels like the psychedelic is acting on you in a bit of a sinister way. For whatever reason, it's kind of sinister, and you start getting the kind of dark thoughts. It almost feels malevolent rather than benevolent. And usually I can tell very early into a trip when it's going into that sinister territory. For whatever reason. I don't know the reason. But it's going in that sinister territory, and I find that I'm not able to control it. Like if it wants to go in that direction, it's going to go in that direction. And even though I want it to go in a more benevolent direction, if I try to push it towards the benevolent direction, it still keeps going in the sinister direction. And so that's what happened in this LSD trip. And I just started having thoughts that didn't feel like they were my own. It felt like I was out of character for myself, because usually I'm a pretty positive, optimistic person. I tend to think along certain lines of thought. But in this trip, my mind just started to kind of go haywire into some weird alien direction. I don't know why I was having weird thoughts that were just uncharacteristic of me. And I didn't like where those thoughts were going, and I didn't feel like I really had much control over them. And again, it felt like the trip was sort of forcing itself on me. And then I wanted out of the trip. But of course, I couldn't get out. So what I did was I started to use a little trick that I like to use when I'm in a bad trip situation, is I try to change the setting. And this is a great trick that you can try to use just to sort of reboot your mind and reboot your mood and your emotional system. You can actually shift your state by moving your body physically, dancing to some music, or in this case, just changing rooms. So that's what I did. I went from the living room to the bathroom, thought, well, maybe that will change things. And it can, because your living room has a different mood than your bathroom. Like if your living room starts to feel sinister, you can go to your bathroom, turn on the lights, make it very bright, and then maybe those bright lights and whatever you see in the bathroom will cheer you up. It's amazing how simple something like that can be. And you can actually see this in children. Like with babies and small children, maybe a child starts to cry. Have you seen this? A baby starts crying and for some silly reason. Someone stole the baby's toy, or maybe somebody accidentally bumped into the baby, now the baby's crying. And the baby can get stuck in that frame of mind. It can just keep crying and crying and crying and crying for the next 30 minutes. But what you can do is you can shift the baby's attention to something else. You can crack a joke. You can literally take the baby, you can coddle the baby, you can take it into a different room, you can turn the lights on and off, you can stick your tongue out, you can make some funny like facial gestures and whatever. And the baby's attention could shift out of that negative spiral of bad mood because it's thinking about the bad thing that just happened to it a minute ago. But if you shift its attention to something new, something funny, something weird, whatever, grab its attention, just shift it away, then it's remarkable. The baby can start laughing and giggling as though the bad thing a minute ago didn't even happen. The baby just forgets about it. And so very much on psychedelics, you can use this trick on yourself. Sometimes it'll work, not always will it work, because you are a little bit more sophisticated than a baby and you have a little bit more stickiness to your mind. So anyways, like I went to the bathroom, or just like I laid on the floor looking at the carpet, things like that. And eventually I decided to go outside. So that's like the biggest shift you can make. If you're tripping indoors and you're having a bad trip indoors, after you try all the different rooms and you try all that stuff and it doesn't make you pop out of your bad mood and negative thought spirals, go outside, because outside will be a very significant shift. So I went outside and I was in the sun, basking in the sun, looking at the trees. And a lot of times that will shift your state and your mood. But in this case, it didn't. So I was still having my bad trip outside. And there were some people walking around outside looking at me. Not that they really saw anything different about me, but kind of made me a bit paranoid and self-conscious. But I was just outside, and I knew that at that point, well, I've exhausted all my options for trying to, trick myself out of this bad trip. And so I won't be able to do it. So I got to tough it out. And so that's what I did. I just toughed it out. It didn't feel very good for an hour or two. And then I came back inside at some point. I laid on the carpet. I was kind of in misery on the carpet for 30 minutes or so. And then just something clicked and I popped out of it, popped out of the bad mood. And then from then on, it was all easy and nice. And to this day, I can't really understand why that mood was there, why my mind was going into these sinister directions. It's just how it was. And that's what'll happen sometimes to you. So be prepared for that. And so what do you do in that situation? Well, you can try to manipulate your trips in order to get them to go in the direction you want. But if your manipulations fail, you have to accept that and just resign yourself to wherever the trip is taking you. In general, you don't want to over-manipulate your trips, because if you get too manipulative with them, that's you imposing your ego too much on what consciousness wants to show you, and then that's going to lead to more and more resistance. So at some point, when the resistance becomes too high, the manipulation becomes too high, you have to remember to tell yourself, like, okay, why am I even manipulating all this? Let me just experience the badness of it. Nothing wrong with experiencing some badness. Remind yourself of that. And then usually as soon as you kind of do that, then it's all downhill from there. Because a lot of the bad part of the bad trip is just the anticipation of how bad it's going to get, more so than how bad it really is. It's that old saying of, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And that's sort of a lot of what a bad trip is mostly you anticipating something negative, and that anticipation is itself the worst part of the whole experience. So that happened to me. Let's see, what other bad trips did I have? I had one very difficult trip on 4-ACO-DMT. I haven't talked much about that. I plugged some 4-ACO-DMT. It wasn't a large quantity. It was a very small quantity. It was maybe 10 milligrams or so. And for some reason, it hit me so hard. And the problem with that trip is that, sometimes I'll do a trip where I'm deliberately planning to go very deep, and I'm taking a relatively high dose, and I know I'm taking a relatively high dose because I'm ready to go deep. Other times, I take a trip where I'm just like testing a new substance, and it's a mild dose, and I'm just doing it for tester's sake, just to see how it is, so that in the future, when I trip on it, I can, adjust the dose properly so I can do a nice, deep, proper trip. So that's what I was planning with this trip with 4-ACO-DMT. I took the smallest dose that I would normally take, just 10 milligrams, and I was expecting it to be mild and easy. But what shocked me was that even at 10 milligrams, when plugging it, it was so freaking powerful that it completely took me by surprise, and I really wasn't in the mood to trip that deep. But of course it was too late. So I was in it and there was no going back. And so I just had to deal with it. And 4-ACO-DMT, what does it feel like? It feels very similar to mushrooms. It's pretty twisted. You get a lot of visual hallucinations on it. Very wavy. The whole room becomes very wavy. And it's very fantastical. Like you can dream some crazy stuff on 4-ACO-DMT. At least I can. And so I had some sort of shocking insights about the fact that everything is imaginary and just how imaginary everything is. I started to realize that my entire past is imaginary, my childhood is imaginary. And this was some of the first times that I started to realize that. And it was quite difficult to integrate. But still, thanks to my experience with mushrooms, that first time that I talked about, my first bad trip with mushrooms, I was able to deal with this bad trip better than I did with my first mushroom bad trip. And it didn't traumatize me as much. It didn't scare me as much because I knew that, I've already been through some bad trips in the past. And that gives me confidence that I can weather this new storm that is coming. And so that's also a nice benefit of having some bad trips in your experience base, because you can then trust yourself to be able to handle it, especially if you've handled previous bad trips relatively well. Then you trust that you can also survive this. This too shall pass. It's that old saying. And so that was 4-ACO-DMT. And to this day, I haven't done 4-ACO-DMT again, just because I really respect that substance. It's way more powerful than it seems. And part of the problem with 4-ACO-DMT is that when I was going into it, from the trip reports that I've read, I always read a bunch of trip reports before I try a new substance because I want to get a sense of, what am I getting myself into here? How serious is this going to be? Most of the trip reports for 4-ACO-DMT, they said, oh, it's just like mushrooms. And I said, well, if it's just like mushrooms, I've already done that, so I'm ready for it. Can't be that bad. And I'm going to do a very low dose of it. And so the expectations that I had were incorrect. Maybe that's how it works for other people, but it certainly doesn't work that way for me with 4-ACO-DMT. It's more serious than mushrooms, and it's way more potent than mushrooms, even at 10 milligrams. So maybe for me, 10 milligrams of 4-ACO-DMT is equivalent to 3 to 4 grams of mushrooms, I would estimate. But I would say it's even a little bit more serious. Mushrooms are a little bit more playful, whereas 4-ACO-DMT is more serious for me. It's definitely not a recreational psychedelic for me. Whereas some people will talk about it in a recreational way. So that threw me off a little bit. So another lesson that I learned from that experience and from other experiences with other substances is that just because other people are talking about a psychedelic in a recreational manner, and they say, oh, this psychedelic is good for partying, or, oh, yeah, it's easy, there's not a lot of mindfuck to this one, you can't rely on that. Maybe it'll go that way, but what I noticed for me is that a lot of psychedelics that people claim to be just like party drugs or recreational or just kind of like light and fun, you can be social on them and stuff, and you can have sex on them and stuff like that. For me, it's not like that. For me, it's much more existential. Maybe it's because of my genetics. Maybe it's because of the way my mind works. I don't know. Maybe a combination of both, probably. So nowadays, if I was trying a new substance, I would be much more skeptical, and I would err on the side of presuming that the substance is not going to be a recreational substance, but it's going to be serious. Basically, every new substance I approach as though it's going to be a very serious substance, because it's better to overestimate than it is to underestimate these things. So that's a lesson that I learned that helps me now to avoid bad trips. Other bad trips that I've had. the worst chemical that I've ever taken. You want to hear what that one is? So I've talked in the past my experiences with DPT. It's a beautiful, visionary psychedelic, very powerful, so you have to be careful with it. Of course, I've talked about 5-Amio Dmt, but then I tried a new research chemical called 5-Amio DPT. And I was thinking like, well, 5-Amio Dmt is amazing, and DPT is amazing, so isn't it logical that if you combine 5-Amio Dmt and DPT into 5-Amio DPT, that should be pretty amazing, right? That's what I thought. That's what I was hoping for. So I try a bit of it, like 10 milligrams. And this is the most horrible chemical I've ever put in my body. It's definitely psychedelic. But the problem with it is that it feels almost like a toxin or a poison coursing through your nervous system. It doesn't feel pleasant at all. Your thoughts become discombobulated. When you turn your head, it feels like there's something broken in your spine and in the brain stem. Like every time you turn your head, it almost feels like there's weird like electrical signals that are being sent through your spinal column, but that they're sort of like malfiring and malfunctioning. You can feel the toxic effects of this chemical coursing through your brain. And your heart starts beating in an irregular fashion. So it's obviously not healthy for you, but the only way you can know that is by first trying it. So I was trying it blind. I had no idea what it was going to be like. And there weren't any good trip reports to read about the substance because it's a rare substance that almost nobody has ever tried before. So you're not going to get reliable data on it by reading reports. And so it felt like I poisoned myself. And it was very uncomfortable. But at the same time, it also did expand my consciousness a little bit. But it expanded in such an uncomfortable and kind of twisted and dysfunctional way where it almost felt like I was a broken human. Like imagine if somebody hit you in the head with a baseball bat, not enough to kill you, and not enough to knock you unconscious, but to the point where like you're half retarded and you're stumbling around and you can turn your head and look around and balance, but you're not thinking straight. Your memories aren't coherent. You're not able to string together coherent thoughts. You're not able to use your logical mind the way that you would normally, or even the way that you might on a traditional psychedelic like LSD or mushrooms. It feels like your whole brain is misfiring and misworking. And so I sat there in this uncomfortable state for a couple hours, and I was wondering, like, well, how long is this going to last? 5-Amio Dmt doesn't last very long. It only lasts about 60 minutes when you plug it. And DPT lasts longer. It can last 3 to 4 hours. And so I was wondering, well, is this thing going to last more like 60 minutes or more like 4 hours? Because I don't want 4 hours of this. Well, sure enough, it lasted like 5 hours. And so it was a kind of a miserable, uncomfortable 5 hours or so. It was a lot more persistent than I had hoped. But it was mostly bad simply from a physical perspective. It didn't really take me into any kind of like madness territory where I was losing my mind or having nightmares and hallucinations. I didn't get very much of that because it was a small dose. I'm sure if I took a large dose of it, it would. But then, of course, the body discomfort would have been even worse. I was concerned a bit about how my heart was beating in an irregular manner and about the way that my head, like every time I was turning my head, it felt like something was broken inside my spine and brainstem. And that did concern me. But also, I wasn't really panicked. It wasn't like a super bad trip. I wasn't panicked. I knew that it would pass. So I just sat there on the couch resigned myself to this discomfort and told myself, well, it's gonna pass. It's okay. Even if it's a little bit toxic, it'll be fine. And so after about 5 hours it passed, I went back to normal and everything's been fine. It didn't harm my health or anything like that. So, but that's definitely one you should not take. Of all the psychedelics I've tried, I highly advise you not to experiment with 5-MeO DMT. Horrible, horrible chemical. It just feels wrong to take it. At least that's how it is for me. Maybe for some of you it will work, but I wouldn't risk it. Stay away from that one. Let's see. Other bad trips that I've had. This probably brings me to the last set of bad trips that I'll describe, which is DMT, classic NN-DMT. I'm extremely sensitive to DMT, like ridiculously sensitive to even tiny quantities of DMT. It sends me into infinite consciousness that is so profound that is horrifying and shocking. It's too much to handle, really. So I started experimenting with DMT, vaping it. And the problem with DMT is that it doesn't plug very well. It doesn't work orally very well without something like harmala extract that I didn't want to eat. So anyways, I was vaping it. And with vaping it, especially I was a noob with the vaping process, so I was just teaching myself how to vape, which is difficult because with plugging, you can put 10 milligrams into your syringe and plug 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams, and you're getting exactly 20 milligrams when you do that. Vaping is much more imprecise, especially if your technique is not really dialed in. You can vape, even if you're using something like a glass vapor genie, which I've actually used. I've used what is considered to be the best pipe for vaping DMT. So I use the glass vapor genie, but it's still not that easy to use. And what ends up happening is that you vaporize the DMT, you suck it in through this glass pipe, but the sides of the glass pipe, they're cold and they collect and condense the vapor. Any vapor that touches the glass basically attaches to the glass and crystallizes all along the glass of the pipe. And so what you're actually sucking into your lungs is a portion of the quantity that you put into the pipe. And also, you usually don't vaporize the entire quantity, but some portion of it. So it's a portion of a portion that you're getting. So you're not really sure how much you're getting each time you take a toke of this pipe. And moreover, it very much depends on how you're using your lungs to inhale the DMT. Because if you take a shallow inhale, it can feel like you didn't really get much. And you can just feel threshold effects from the same dose as if you take the same dose, but this time you inhale very deeply, like deep into your lungs, and you're going to get a powerful blast of that shit. You'll get a breakthrough dose. So the difference between a threshold dose and a breakthrough dose for me, sucking on this pipe, is it's very tricky to get that just right. And so it's easy to underdo it, and then you say, okay, fuck, I'm going to put more in there. You put more in there, then you take one big hit, and then you overdo it by accident. So it's hard to dial that in, and you really never know exactly how much you're sucking in every time. And it also depends how long you hold it. You suck it in, and then you hold it. You try to hold it for as long as you can. The longer you hold it, the more powerful it's going to be. Because as soon as you exhale, you're actually going to be exhaling DMT crystals if you didn't absorb it all into your lungs, which can take 20 to 30 seconds. So as I was experimenting with all that, using trial and error, making a bunch of mistakes, I took a couple of really big hits of that DMT. And man, it sends me into such a profound state of infinite consciousness. And it's so loving. Like, it's got so much love to it, especially DMT for me. It's just like, it's pure love, pure fucking love. You're basically inhaling love. And I inhaled so much of this love that my entire visual field sort of started twisting in on itself into 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional shapes that are completely mind-boggling and out of this world. And it's just, it's a terrifying degree of love. And so, overall, DMT is amazing. I love it. But if I take too much of it, I just get pummeled by this crippling degree of love that my body and mind can barely contain. And it almost drives me into a suicidal state where it's so loving and so beautiful that it makes me want to kill myself. And of course, that can be dangerous. So any time that you're taking psychedelics and they bring you to a point where you start getting suicidal thoughts for whatever reasons, whether you're depressed or it could be the opposite because you're so happy and you're so loving. You're so filled with love that you don't even care if you live anymore. That's what it does to me. That's when you know you've taken too much and you're in dangerous territory. And actually, one of the most paradoxical things about love, you think, well, Leo, how can love be bad? It sounds like you're describing a good trip. Like, why are you being such a pussy? Why don't you just accept the love and enjoy it? Why are you making it so difficult? Well, I guarantee that if you experience these degrees of love that I'm talking about ever in your life, you're actually going to find it traumatizing. It's going to traumatize you. Imagine so much love, it's traumatic. It's hard for us to imagine that because we think that trauma has to be bad stuff. Trauma can only be pain and suffering. Well, that's usually the case, but weird things happen when you take DMT or other psychedelics. You know, things turn inside out. And so, yeah, you can experience so much love and bliss that it actually becomes counterproductive and it becomes painful and you actually want it to stop because it's too much. So that was difficult. And then, of course, there's a lot to integrate after that. It comes with many very twisted and mind-fucky insights that you have to integrate after you come back. So anyways, with DMT, what I learned is be very careful with your vaping technique, like very, very, very careful. Because also the other problem with vaping is that vaping hits you so hard and so fast compared to plugging or oral administration. It hits you so fast within like 30 seconds. You go from 0 to 60 in 30 seconds. And there's no way to control it. You're not even going to have time to run outside the way you would with LSD or mushrooms. You can go outside, you can go into a different room, maybe you can turn on some fun music and dance, you can turn on a YouTube video, some comedy and watch it, and maybe you can even find a video online of somebody talking to you, trying to talk you down from your negative thoughts. You can't do that within 30 seconds of vaping that DMT. First of all, that DMT, it hits your lungs so hard that it takes you like a minute just to recover because you inhale it and then it's stinging your lungs for about 30 seconds and you have to hold it for 30 seconds just to absorb it all. But that 30 seconds is already enough to get you to near the peak of this trip. And by the time you exhale, you're already like, you're so zoned out from normal reality after those 30 seconds. You're not going to have time to run to a different room or to change your mood or to think different thoughts. Like, you are fucking flying off into a different universe. And that can be terrifying. And it's the rate and speed at which it happens is so fast that in of itself makes it more terrifying. Because there's less room there for you to maneuver, to manipulate, to calm yourself down, to talk yourself out of something, to even give yourself encouragement and give yourself a little pep talk. Like ordinarily on mushrooms or LSD, you could say, well, I've had bad trips in the past. This will just be another one like that. I can stomach it and get through it. And see, that already took 30 seconds just to explain that to myself. In this time, I'd already be in an infinite sort of like a DMT headspace. It just the speed at which it happens itself can be terrifying. So anyways, what I learned there is, be very careful with vaping. I wouldn't vape DMT if there was a better method to take it. Now, you can try pharmawaska, ayahuasca, that kind of stuff, but then you get into the problems of vomiting. I don't really like that. I've tried plugging it. It doesn't really work well plugged. You need very, very large dosages to plug it. So it's very wasteful of your substance. You also need to plug it alongside with something like Harmala, a Maui. And so that's not ideal. So anyways, with DMT, I learned to be more careful. And also, honestly, I haven't done very much DMT after that because I wouldn't say I'm traumatized by it, but I have a very healthy caution and respect for it. Like, I know how fucking powerful it is. So I treat it like a bottle of nitroglycerin. That's my attitude towards DMT. It's like nitroglycerin. And in general, I recommend that attitude towards any psychedelic that you're about to take. You should have some trepidation before you take it. Sometimes people say, Leo, I'm about to take a psychedelic and I have a little bit of anxiety. Is that wrong? Should I not take it then? So here's my thoughts on that. I think it's actually very important that you do have some pre-trip anxiety. I call it pre-trip anxiety. Pre-trip anxiety means that you're about to take a psychedelic, you're committed to taking it, you know you're going to take it, but you're a little nervous. The reason that is because you're thinking back to other times in the past you've taken it, and maybe you remember some bad trips, and you remember how powerful it can be, and so you have a healthy respect for it. In the same way that if you were in the same room as a wild lion, you would be very careful in that room. With every step you took, you would be very careful. You'd keep your eyes dead on that lion, and you'd walk on your tiptoes very carefully towards the door or the window, all the while looking at that lion to make sure that you don't make any kind of wrong move until you get out that door. So that's the approach you should take with psychedelics. And you would actually be in a state of adrenaline and anxiety with that lion in that room. Because you got to be able to jump through that window. You got to be able to haul ass out of there in case that lion starts moving towards you, right? You got to think really fast. And that's perfectly healthy in that situation. What would be dysfunctional is if you were in that room with that lion and you were just behaving normally and chilling out as though it was all fine and dandy. That would be the dysfunction. Well, likewise with psychedelics, if you are just like dumping scoops of psychedelics into your pipe with reckless abandon, just like a happy idiot, thinking that, oh, everything is fine, I don't got to worry about anything. You're not nervous even a little bit. That tells me you don't understand the power of what you're dealing with. So for me, even when I hold a psychedelic in my hand, the whole mood changes. It does feel like I'm holding a bottle of nitroglycerin. It's a volatile substance. If I drop this bottle, it's going to explode. It's going to kill me. That's my attitude. And with the psychedelic, I have that same kind of very serious attitude where it's like, there's enough psychedelic in this little bag to kill me. If I take one too many scoops of this stuff, it could kill me. And so I have that respect going in, and I have a little bit of anxiety. Now, it's not a panic attack, it's not full-blown fear, and it's not a paranoia where I start fantasizing about all the horrible shit that's about to happen to me after I take this. Because if I was doing that, then that would result in a very bad trip. So it's not like that. I have positive expectations. So I'm, in general, I try to hold the psychedelic as a benevolent force or substance. It's a benevolent thing that's going to help me. But at the same time, I know how powerful it is. And I know that if I take too much of it, it's going to turn sour very quickly. So it's benevolent in the right dosages, done in the right ways, in the right settings, when it's done very responsibly. Then it's benevolent. And so it's like that. In the same way that if you were devoutly religious, you would go into a church and you would pray at the altar of the church. And there would be a figure there of the Virgin Mary or Christ or whoever you pray to, Buddha or some Vishnu deity or whatever. You would be praying at the altar to this idol, and you would have a almost irrational reverence for this idol. You wouldn't just sit there in front of the Virgin Mary statue if you were a true Christian, and you would treat it just like any other object. You wouldn't treat it as though it was just like a glass of water, or if it was a statue of a horse. You give special importance to that Virgin Mary statue. You actually believe that that is like a sacred object. You don't spit on it. You don't curse in front of it. You treat it with reverence. Well, that's my attitude towards psychedelics. And there's a very good reason for this. There's a practical reason. See, it's not just a fantasy in my own mind. It is a little bit of a fantasy, and I know it's a little bit of a fantasy that I'm sort of putting the psychedelic on this little bit of a sacred pedestal. But I do that for a good reason, because it's extremely powerful in what it'll do to your consciousness, and it deserves that respect. And as soon as you drop that level of respect, you're going to start to use it irresponsibly, and it'll bite you in the ass. So I've learned that just from experience. That's what all of my bad trips have taught me in a nutshell. So there you go. Those are probably the most memorable bad trips that I've had. Maybe I've had a few others that are mildly bad, but I've probably even forgotten about them now. I'd have to go through all my memory banks to remember them all. That gives you a good sampling of what this stuff is like. And I should warn you, though, that... Oh, hold on. I did forget one. I got to tell you about the Salvia. I have an old episode on my blog which talks about my Salvia trip. So I won't go into it in too much detail. But yeah, Salvia also was one of the most challenging trips that I took. And I took a threshold dose of Salvia. I also vaped it. Vaped a threshold dose of Salvia, which I don't recommend you do. Salvia is a very dangerous psychedelic. It's actually a deliriant. It's so alien and so fucking twisted that I took a little hit of it just to test it out. And already I felt the power of it. It was so alien. It felt like an alien force. A sinister alien force was just taking over my entire visual field. And the way that it affected me was so weird because it only affected half my visual field. So half my visual field, you know how the left hemisphere is cross-wired with the right arm and the right visual field. And then the right hemisphere is cross-wired with the left visual field and the left arm. You have this kind of weird wiring in the human organism. So when I vaped some of this Salvia, for some reason it hit one of my hemispheres more than the others. And so one of my visual field was basically going into infinity, and the other half of my visual field was totally normal. And it was going deeper and deeper into this roiling infinity, and it felt like I was getting sucked into this hole of infinity. And I started losing all sense of self, even at a like at a profound biographical level. So I couldn't even remember memories of my childhood anymore. That's how profound this degree of no self was. Salvia gave me one of the deepest no self experiences that I've ever had. And I've had no self experiences without psychedelics. I've had them on various kinds of psychedelics. But what's so remarkable about Salvia is that it just temporarily, it wipes away all sense of self to the point where you can't even understand what it means to be human. You're sitting here, you still look like a human, but you don't think of yourself as a human, and you can't even remember what it's like to be a human. And you can't even remember that you ever were a human. That's how fucking weird it is. And then you even start to forget your own name. You start to forget where you came from. Like ordinarily, if I ask you, where'd you come from? You say, well, I was born on a planet in the 21st century to a mother and a father in this country. I had a brother and a sister. Something like that. Well, when you smoke this salvia, all that flies out the window. You can't even remember that shit anymore. And it doesn't even make sense. You try to think like, brother, what is a brother? And you start thinking about a brother. I have a brother? And then the idea of having a brother doesn't even make sense anymore. It simply doesn't compute in your mind. That can be pretty terrifying. And the idea that you're located on a planet, Earth, in the middle of a star system somewhere, this also doesn't compute anymore. In fact, you can't even remember the building that you're in, because like you're sitting in a room, and right now you're assuming that this room is part of a house, your house, wherever you are, and this is outside in some neighborhood, whatever. Well, all of that gets wiped away, such that you're sitting in this room, you're sitting in your house, you smoke this salvia, but you don't know where this room is located. You don't even know that it's a room per se, or that it's part of a house. You don't know what the outside of your house looks like, because that's been wiped away, because it's just called concepts and images in your mind. All that's wiped away, and so you're sitting here in this room, but it feels so foreign to you, you don't even know that it's your room. For all you know, you could be in some stranger's house at that moment. And that was just a threshold dose, so I immediately realized how powerful this fucking thing is. And I was spooked by it pretty good, and I've never gone back since to try more. I don't really have a desire to go down that rabbit hole, because it's going to be, I can tell it's going to be terrifying. Like you can completely freak yourself out with salvia if you're not careful. So don't do it, is my advice. So anyways, let's wrap up here. Some final thoughts on bad trips. First of all, you should know that everything I've described up to this point is nowhere near how bad a bad trip can get. They can get way, way worse than this. So don't think that this is as bad as it gets. In a sense, these are mild bad trips that I'm describing. And the reason that is because I've been very careful and responsible. And even so, I got myself into a little bit of trouble, but overall, I've been very careful. Most people aren't this careful. They're sloppy. And when you get sloppy, then you can have way worse trips than this. So let that be a warning to you. The biggest thing you can do to avoid bad trips is lower your doses. Treat your substance with respect and reverence. Don't trip too frequently. That's actually another thing I forgot to mention, is that I did have difficulty and certain kinds of bad trips when I was doing my 30-day 5-Amio Dmt retreat. I did a period where I did 5-Amio Dmt every single day for 30 days. I published a video about that in the past. Go check that out. But anyways, that was problematic because I was doing it on a very fixed schedule, because I wanted to make sure I did 30 days in a row. I wasn't even able to complete the full 30 days. I only did about 28 days. Because by the 28th day, I was tripping without even needing to take psychedelic. I was just tripping 24/7. I couldn't even sleep. I couldn't fall asleep because in my sleep, I was tripping. I was tripping nonstop. There was so much 5-MeO in my system. So, what started happening in maybe the last 5 days of that 30-day retreat is that I was going into such deep levels of consciousness that I was starting to lose my sense of reality and groundedness into this, what we call consensus material reality. I stopped being able to sleep. And it really felt like I was losing touch with the world, losing touch with people, with humanity, with my family. And it felt like there was nobody that I could turn to for help because I was losing touch with even the idea of somebody who could help me at that point. And it was very, very challenging, but hey, it was a 30-day challenge. I was doing that for a specific reason. It was like a scientific test that I was running to see, how far can you really push this? So what I discovered is basically that you can push it very far, and when you push it that far and you do it too much like that, you will become so ungrounded that it can become dangerous to your life, to your health, and to your sanity. You will start to lose your mind. You won't be able to sleep properly, and other problems can result. So, another important thing you should avoid is tripping too frequently. Don't be tripping on a daily basis. That's a very bad idea and a clear sign that you're starting to misuse psychedelics. Give yourself plenty of time to integrate between trips. And if it takes you 3 months to integrate between trips, then give it 3 months. That's what you need. So be flexible, be adaptable, be fluid with how you go about it. And remember that you can try to manipulate your state. If you're in a bad mood, you can turn on some happy music, listen to it. That could help. But ultimately, don't be too afraid of bad trips either, because that in and of itself will create bad trips if you're afraid of bad trips. Your attitude should be, if there's going to be a difficult trip, it's okay. I've handled them in the past. I can handle them again. As long as I'm following protocol responsibly, I'm not taking too much. I know that it's going to last for a few hours. I'm going to come out of it. It's fine. And basically just give yourself a pep talk. Reassure yourself when you're in the middle of a bad trip that this will only last for a few hours. It's going to pass. You're going to come back to normal. Because in the worst trips, your mind will try to trick you that you're never coming back to normal. And if you buy into that trick, then you will get panicky and afraid, and you might do stupid things. And also, as a final warning, watch yourself physically as you're taking psychedelics to make sure that you're not being physically irresponsible. What I mean by that is that if you're taking psychedelics and they make you lose control of your body, where your body starts doing dysfunctional or unhealthy or dangerous things, and you're not able to control it, that is a clear sign that you got to lower your dose or take time off or change your substance. It's very important that you retain motor control of your body and that you don't lose that. So, for example, if you take a large dose of DMT and then you start punching holes in the wall of your house because you can't control yourself, you're so out of control, you're filled with so much anger or whatever, that tells you that you're in dangerous territory. Because when you lose control of your body, which means that you could punch somebody, you could jump off a rooftop, you could run outside naked, you could stick your hand in the stove, you could cut yourself with a knife, you could shoot yourself with a gun, these sorts of things. If you feel like you're losing control to the point where you cannot comfortably prevent yourself from doing these things because you're so compulsive that if you see a knife, you feel the need to grab it and to play with it, and you can't stop yourself, that is a clear sign that you're in dangerous territory and you need to stop or dial back. Because if you keep doing that, eventually something's going to go wrong and you're going to harm yourself physically, or you're going to harm somebody else physically. So those are my bad trips. If you have some of yours, feel free to post them down below, or come check out the forum and post your trip reports on the forum. One of my favorite things to do on the forum, on the Actualized forum, is to read y'all's trip reports. Some of y'all's trip reports are very entertaining and interesting and even enlightening. So come share those stories, or if you want to read other people's stories, come read stories. Use the search function on the forum and you can find lots of different trip reports that folks have submitted over the years. And other than that, I recommend you trip safe, trip responsibly, trip at moderate dosages. And if you do that, then psychedelics can revolutionize your life. But if you're going to be sloppy and irresponsible and immature, then don't do psychedelics at all, because you will destroy your life. I'm not kidding. You will destroy your life if you treat these things like a toy. So you've been warned.